All right, welcome back, everybody. I told you last week that we made it to my favorite part of the semester. That's the good news. The bad news is we've also made it to the most difficult part of the semester. If you did the weekly reading, if you did the readings last week, you probably struggled a little bit, and that's okay. That's kind of the point of introducing this material to you the first time. We're going to get some practice with it today. The reason I'm sharing this all with you and the reason why it's my favorite part of the semester is because a lot of people are really bad at making arguments. A lot of people are really bad at telling when other people are making bad arguments. And I want you all to get better at that. I want you all to win. Whether that is on the internet and you get the king of the internet or queen of the internet crown, or whether that's in your interpersonal conversations or fighting with a significant other or a parent or a friend. I want you to make the best arguments that you can. I want you to get better at not being persuaded by the arguments that other people are making. Because if you look at most of the arguments we hear every day, a lot of them are actually pretty terrible, but they sound pretty good on their face. And so the challenge that I have for you is to try and figure out what's being said, and more importantly, what's not being said when other people are trying to persuade you. So we're going to get a little bit of practice with persuasion and unraveling and unpacking and hopefully strengthening persuasion today. In order to do that, we're going to review a little bit about what we talked about last week. What I told you last week is that we're also going to expand upon that. So there's some good news and bad news about persuasion. I'll tell you that when I was sitting in your shoes, the classes that I had that talked about persuasion were my favorite classes. And the reason for that is because you can probably guess I like to win. I like to make persuasive arguments. I like those arguments to be convincing. I like to have the best tools when I'm making persuasive arguments. And a lot of my professors when I was an undergrad said, if you just learn stasis theory, if you just learn the Toulmin model, if you just learn different kinds of argumentation, you can get anybody to do whatever you want. You just have to be able to say the right thing in the right place at the right time in the right way. And I just lit up. I got really excited about that. And then I started taking a social science class on persuasion, and that mindset for me was shattered. And what shattered it for me is this theory that you'll see up on the board. You'll see that this theory is also a little bit old, not so old compared to some of the other things we're talking about in here. But this theory is called social judgment theory. It's a theory from 1965. And social judgment theory is talking about persuasion. It's trying to measure how persuasion works. And a lot of you have probably taken surveys where you filled out a Likert scale or you filled out a semantic differential that has different versions of options of how you feel or how well you think you're doing at something. And so we see up on the board, if you look on the left side of the screen, you'll see strongly in favor all the way down to strongly opposed. You've probably seen opinion surveys just like that. They're trying to measure your attitudes and values and beliefs and likely behaviors. And they're trying to measure that to see how willing you are to change your mind. This theory that ruined that part of persuasion for me is called social judgment theory. And the reason it ruined it for me is because I thought that if someone was strongly in favor of something and I wanted them to become strongly opposed to it, or vice versa, that if I just said the right thing in the right place at the right time, that magically they would say, you know what, I never thought of it that way, Brad, you're right, okay, fine, that wins. And they would be done with it and they'd be on my side forever. If you look at the right side of the screen, I've paired all of those different markings with a scenario where maybe I'm asking someone out on a date. And maybe I've met this person once or twice, or maybe I've met them a few more times than that, but they have probably a first impression of me. So they might say, I don't know, you're cute, but I still don't know. I'm still working through some things, or maybe I just don't know how much I trust you. We're going to say that is the position of the girl that I'm trying to attract. Okay, so she thinks I'm cute, but she's not sure, she's not quite ready to say that she's going to marry me. That you're cute, but I still don't know is what's called her anchor position. An anchor position is where you are on that continuum right now. And what this theory gives us, what social judgment theory gives us, is different categories. One of them is called a latitude of acceptance. And a latitude of acceptance means that if she has the first impression of you're cute, but I still don't know, and I ask her to marry me, she's probably not quite there yet. But she might be willing to move from you're cute, I still don't know, to Friday night sounds great, and therefore we have our first date. Or if I screw up a little bit, maybe she'll say, well, it might take a few dates to see if I'm even interested in anything romantic. If I really screw up, she might move to no, but I have a sister, or maybe beyond that. The latitude of acceptance is from your anchor position, what are other ranges of possibilities that you might be willing to accept? And you can probably guess that the next piece of social judgment theory is what's called a latitude of rejection. A latitude of rejection is everything that's not included in that latitude of acceptance. So if she's already at you're cute, but I still don't know, and I get down on one knee and ask her to marry me, she's probably going to think I'm a weirdo. If I say something, if I really screw up, she's probably going to say, I have pepper spray and I know how to use it. There are positions that she's willing to accept right now. Anything that is not part of that latitude of acceptance is part of her latitude of rejection. So maybe if she's at let's just be friends, it's not very likely that I'm going to get her to Friday night sounds great. The latitude of acceptance is small. Maybe after a few persuasive interactions, I could persuade her to move up the ladder. If you know anything about romantic relationships, a lot of people go through a phase where they meet. A lot of people then go through a phase where somebody asks someone else out on a date. They date for a little while, they see if it works. If it's working well, they go through a phase of engagement, and if they go through engagement, they go through marriage, and hopefully then they stay that way. What social judgment theory did to shatter my worldview is to show me that a lot of people don't really move all that much in one persuasive interaction. Persuasion usually operates on a continuum, and you can't necessarily expect someone who's strongly opposed to something to become strongly in favor of it, or vice versa. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we're talking about persuasion, because a lot of you, when you get to giving persuasive speeches or making persuasive arguments in other classes or in your personal lives, are going to want people to accept things that are already in their latitude of rejection, and they're not going to budge on that. The way that you get them to budge, perhaps, is by making a really strong case. There are some times when people say those magic words, I never thought of it that way, and they change their minds and they realize they were wrong. They don't happen all that often. What's more likely the case is that their latitude of acceptance will change the more times they interact with you in your arguments. Nevertheless, I want to pretend for the rest of class today that we are going to make the best arguments that we can to try and get people to move as far as possible on this continuum. So in order to get there, what we need to do a little bit is to review what we talked about last week. Because last week we talked about stasis theory, and I told you that stasis theory is only part of the equation, and that we were going to build upon that this week. What I told you is that last week, when we're talking about the 5 stases, we are talking about claims, but claims are only as strong as the evidence and reasoning that they depend upon. If someone is going to try and get you to their position on something, and they don't provide any evidence, or that evidence is weak, you're probably not very likely to accept their conclusion or their claim. Reasoning, then, is the direct link between that evidence and that claim. And I'll tell you that these things often operate as a triangle. Reasoning is usually the most abstract part of this triangle, but it's also where most of the problems happen with persuasion. So what I'm going to try and teach you today is how to get better at reasoning. Recognizing what kinds of reasoning people are using, evaluating whether that reasoning is good or whether that reasoning might be flawed. In order to get there, let's just review a little bit of stasis theory. This is what we talked about last week. I recognize that some of you might not have been here. Even if you were here, I recognize that stasis theory is a little bit abstract. When we're talking about stasis theory, we're talking about different realms of persuasion, different kinds of arguments that somebody could make. So we have the stasis of factor conjecture that's dealing with being and existence, and that stasis is concerned with whether something happened in the past, is happening now, will happen in the future, is true, is not true, exists or doesn't exist. The stasis of definition is dealing with what we call something. Is it an X or a Y? The example I gave last week is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? How do you know and why? You can make different arguments about what words mean and what things belong in which categories. Causes and consequences are kinds of arguments that deal with cause and effect. Does X actually cause Y? From there, we get into questions of value, and we're evaluating whether something is good or bad, or whether it's beautiful or ugly, just or unjust, fair or unfair, ethical or unethical. They're value judgments. And last but not least, we have the stasis of policy, and the stasis of policy is what should we do in any given situation. I walked you through an example last week talking about abortion, and I said one thing that's true about the stases is that they are interdependent. That is, what happens at one stasis often has implications for what happens at the other stases. So it's very rare that you have a policy claim that has all of the other four stases resolved. Usually, if we're arguing about policy, there's some issue somewhere earlier on, whether it's factor conjecture or causes and consequences or value, that's unresolved. What we're going to deal with today is treating one of these at a time instead of all five of them at a time. And we're going to do that by adding to them evidence that we can use when we have that kind of claim, and reasoning. How do we know that that evidence actually supports that claim and in a good way? This is where things get a little complicated. This is probably the most difficult lecture of the semester. This is probably the most difficult course material, so I'm going to try and go through it in a way that makes sense. And the best way that I can do that is teach you some of the ideas and then give you some examples to try and work through on your own. I'll warn you in advance that a lot of you are going to get really frustrated when I do that. A lot of you are going to try and you're going to get things wrong. And I know that people don't like looking stupid and being told that they are wrong. But sometimes that's part of the learning process, and that's what we need to be able to do. So what we're dealing with today is building upon stasis theory to talk about how we know what we know. It's a branch of philosophy called epistemology. I'm not going to concern you with epistemology, but what we're dealing with here is trying to figure out when we have new information, how do we know we can trust that information? And most of the time, if you take an Introduction to Logic course, you're going to do a lot of proofs. Some of you might see this in logic, or some of you might see this if you've ever taken a geometry class and you have a whole bunch of axioms about different kinds of angles, or whether things are congruent, or whether things are similar. You've probably seen that in a geometry class. We're using arguments in a logic class. And what we do when we are faced with a new argument is new arguments consist of a building block, and that building block has a big name that's up on the board here. That building block is called a syllogism. And a syllogism consists of three parts. It's got a major premise, which is a rule that is either always true or mostly true most of the time. That major premise, that's the general principle, is then applied to a specific example. That's what's called the minor premise. And when we pair the major premise with the minor premise, we can draw a conclusion, or we can draw the argument. The argument is the part of this that's persuasive. It's taking the stuff that we know or think we know and trying to apply it to stuff that we don't know in order to evaluate whether we can learn new information. So the syllogism is a basic building block of argument, and it's got those three parts. You've probably encountered these in a bunch of logical tests that you've seen over the course of your life. So we have the major premise here, the general principle, the general rule, all rats are mammals. That's how we classify mammals in biology, and we have within the mammal kingdom a whole bunch of different species. Rats are one of those species, so we know that to be true. The second thing is maybe I go to a pet store and I buy a rat and I name the rat Fred. I have this general knowledge that all rats are mammals. I have this specific knowledge that Fred is a rat. Therefore, I could draw the conclusion that what? Fred is a mammal. Very good. So you've seen this play out, and it seems pretty straightforward when we're talking about things that we know with absolute certainty. That's the kind of pattern that we're going to be using for a lot of our evidence and reasoning. Now there's three main types of syllogisms that we have, and I want you to get comfortable with these. You can probably figure out the conclusions based on some of them. But let's say we start off with the first one. The first one is what's called a categorical syllogism. This one is usually dealing with definitions, so you can probably see the X's and Y categories. I'll tell you that I used to work at a coffee shop. Some of you might remember that from when we talked about your Techne speeches. And at that coffee shop, I learned counterintuitively that light roast coffees usually have more caffeine than dark roast coffees. And that's counterintuitive because if you know a lot about fruits and vegetables, the darker the color, the fruit or vegetable, the more chemicals it usually has in it. That's not usually true with coffee. The difference between light roast and dark roast coffees actually has to do with where the beans are grown and soil content and things like that. So light roast coffees are usually grown in regions of the world like Central America and certain parts of Africa, where they tend to be more acidic and as a result have more caffeine. Whereas dark roast coffees are usually grown in places like Indonesia, and they maybe don't get quite as dark or quite as light. They don't get quite that acidity, and they don't therefore usually have that much caffeine. Now, while I worked at this coffee shop, my boss used to have us every morning come in, and he'd give us 3 coffees to try, and we were supposed to become coffee connoisseurs, kind of like how a lot of people become wine connoisseurs. And we were supposed to taste not only whether it was a light roast or a dark roast coffee, but maybe what that coffee was made with. So maybe it was made with citrus fruit. Maybe it was made with cocoa beans. Maybe it was made with certain kinds of nuts. And we were supposed to try and guess what kind of coffee we had to see if we could train our palates to recognize coffee so that we could better talk about that coffee to our customers. So I would sample these cups of coffee, and I got pretty good at telling a light roast from a dark roast. I never quite made it to the connoisseur level who could tell the other things that went in there. But let's say I'm drinking my morning coffee, and I happen to buy my coffee, so I don't know where it came from. I'm drinking that coffee, and I say, tastes like a light roast. If I know that light roasts usually have more caffeine than dark roasts, and if I know that this one tastes like a light roast, I can probably come to the conclusion that this one has more caffeine than a cup of coffee I would have gotten elsewhere. So I can pretty much trust that. That's pretty much a general rule. It applies to the specific case, and therefore I can draw that conclusion. From that conclusion, now that I can know what I think I know, that my coffee has more caffeine, I can probably also make other judgments, like I'm going to teach lecture later today, and if I drink this entire large cup of coffee, I'm probably going to be pretty jittery, so maybe I only drink half of it. That's what we're dealing with the categorical syllogism. It's that all x's are y's, x or w is an x, therefore w is a y. Another type of syllogism that we could have is what's called a disjunctive syllogism. A disjunctive syllogism is an either-or situation. It's maybe A or B, or it's A, B, or C, or A, B, C, or D. And we can only arrive at conclusions by ruling out other possibilities. So this one, let's say I go for dinner, and I'm out at dinner, and the waiter comes by, and every entree comes with an appetizer, so the waiter says to me, would you like a soup or a salad? I might say in response to that waiter, well, I don't like salad. If those are my only 2 options, the waiter can then determine that the proper conclusion is that I want the soup. That's a likely conclusion based on that information. The third type that we have is an if-then kind of syllogism. It's called a hypothetical syllogism. If X happens, then Y will also happen. So let's say I really like to play soccer, and let's say we're talking not in October in North Dakota, but maybe in July in Missouri, and I want to play soccer. And I go to my weather app to see if it's likely that I'm going to be able to play soccer. I know that if it rains tonight, and people are telling me it might rain tonight, then my soccer game is probably going to be canceled because I don't like to play soccer in the rain. The forecast says that there's an 80% chance of rain, and therefore I can reasonably assume that I probably will not have soccer that day. So maybe I don't bring my soccer stuff with me to work, maybe I don't bring my cleats or the ball or anything like that, and maybe I don't get my hopes up that I can play soccer after I'm done teaching. Those are different kinds of syllogisms that we can have, and syllogisms work really well for information that is absolute. Information where we know it's either X or Y, or all X's are Y's, or if X happens, then Y will also happen. All 3 of these examples, however, are not absolute scenarios. In the first one, the light roast coffee might have more caffeine than the dark roast, but let's say my barista put more grounds into my coffee than normal, and so maybe the dark roast actually has more caffeine. If they were the same amount, the light roast probably would. But if they were different amounts of coffee, then they're going to be different amounts of caffeine as well. In the waiter example, the disjunctive syllogism, if I say I don't like salad, the waiter assumes that I want the soup, but it's possible that I don't want either one of those things. Or maybe they have something else on the menu, and I say, can I substitute fries in for one of those? Finally, in the hypothetical, we have an 80% chance of rain. I used to work in the town where the company AccuWeather is based. And I love AccuWeather because oftentimes it was in AccuWeather. It happened to rain a lot in State College, Pennsylvania. And AccuWeather is based there. And it would often be raining. And my weather app on AccuWeather would say, there is a 0% chance of rain, to which I would respond, look out the window. If you want to call yourselves AccuWeather, you have to know how to predict the weather. Nevertheless, you all have been in scenarios where somebody says there's an 80% chance of rain, and you assume that it's actually going to rain, and then it doesn't. Or there's a 20% chance of rain, and it downpours, and you have no idea what to do with that. So we want syllogisms to tell us how we know what we think we know, and we want them to be right. We want to know that we're right. We want to know that we have trustworthy information because a lot of things depend on these kinds of decisions that we're making. In order to know whether a syllogism is right and whether we can trust it, we have to have two things. We have to test it for two things. The first is what's called validity. And validity means that the major premise and the minor premise are directly related. It follows the proper format. And if those things are directly related, there's only one conclusion. Therefore, Fred is a mammal. Therefore, it's probably going to rain. If a syllogism is valid, the major premise and the minor premise have to be related directly in a way that you could draw that conclusion from that relationship. The other thing we have to test for is what philosophers or argumentation scholars or communication scholars call soundness. And soundness means that the major premise and minor premise are not necessarily just related, but that both the major premise and the minor premise are true. They are factually accurate. If we have a valid and sound syllogism, then we can trust that information. If the syllogism is valid but not sound, or sound but not valid, or neither, then we can't trust that syllogism. So we want to know that what we are drawing as new conclusions from stuff that we didn't know before, we want to know that that stuff is accurate. In order to test it, we have to look for both of these. So let me give you an example. We could have a syllogism that is valid but not sound. A starting major premise, a general principle that we could apply to a lot of things, is all flying animals can shoot lasers from their eyes. If I were going to say that that's true, we would then say dogs can fly. If that's our major premise and that's our minor premise, those two things are directly related so that we could draw a conclusion from them. What is that conclusion? Somebody want to try? Should be pretty straightforward like the other ones. Therefore, all dogs can shoot lasers from their eyes. We like to think that that makes total logical sense in our brains, except we know from our own experience that that's not accurate. So what's the problem with this? Why is it a problem that the syllogism is valid but not sound? How do we know that we can't accept that conclusion? Or how would we question that conclusion? Yeah. Okay, so dogs can't fly. We know that much. We also know that flying animals like birds, most of them, I don't think any of them, can shoot lasers from their eyes. So the syllogism, the major premise and the minor premise follow the proper form and it looks all good, except none of these premises are factually accurate and therefore the conclusion is flawed as well. We could also have the opposite. We could have a conclusion that's sound but not valid. A sound conclusion would mean that the individual premises are all true, but they're not necessarily related. So let's try that out. If I'm being honest, I can say factually I had a sandwich for lunch yesterday. That is a true statement. I could also say that Nancy Cartwright is the voice of Bart Simpson. Some people are surprised to learn that Bart Simpson is played by a woman, but that's nevertheless something that is true. If I were trying to pair those together, what is the conclusion that would follow from those two premises? Got a major premise, I've got a minor premise. What's the conclusion? Anybody want to try? Conclusion might be, I watched too much television while eating my sandwich. The conclusion also could be, therefore the earth revolves around the sun. All three of those statements, major premise, minor premise, and conclusion, are sound. That is, they are true. They are factually accurate. But we can't draw the conclusion that the earth revolves around the sun, true as that may be, from those premises. It doesn't follow the proper format, and therefore we can't conclude from those premises that that's a valid conclusion. We might have other syllogisms that we could make with that conclusion, like watching the position of the sun and the moon, or the fact that we have seasons, or the fact that we can fly from different places around the world. Whatever it happens to be, we can't draw that conclusion from these premises. Or we could have some times where we have neither of those things. It's neither sound nor valid. All Germans spontaneously combust at age 34. My brother likes to eat bicycles, and therefore I am a pregnant cat. Makes absolutely no sense to us, and most of us would be able to pick up on that one, but might not be able to pick up on the dogs can fly, and therefore they can shoot lasers from their eyes argument. It sounds good. It doesn't quite work. So in order to know what we think we know when we have a syllogism, it needs to be both sound and valid. And syllogisms are the building blocks of how we argue from known information to unknown information. Syllogisms are good most of the time. The problem with that is most of us don't actually talk that way in everyday conversation. So if every conversation that we had with some persuasive component were stated in major premise, minor premise, conclusion, we would never get anything done. People who are hungry should eat food. I am hungry, therefore I should go eat. If you talked like that all the time, people would just tell you, just expletive, eat already. Why are you spending all this time trying to justify things that we already know? Most of the time in everyday conversation, what we have is a limited or a truncated, shortened version of a syllogism. That truncated version, that abridged version, however you want to say it, is what ancient Greeks called an enthymeme. This is also coming from Aristotle. Remember that Aristotle is giving you a lot of your theory. He's giving you ethos, pathos, and logos. He's giving you the 5 canons. Aristotle's enthymeme is a shortened version of the syllogism. What Aristotle rightly observed about 2,500 years ago is that people don't talk in syllogisms when they're trying to persuade. What they often do is will give a syllogism with only 2 of those 3 parts. Usually it'll be the minor premise and the conclusion, but that major premise, that major principle, that general rule is usually omitted. And it's usually omitted because it's often taken at face value. It's often some general claim about people and human behavior that we like to think is true of all people, but it's actually true of most people, or it's true of some people, or of some circumstances. The term enthymeme comes from the ancient Greek word thumos. Thumos in ancient Greek might be translated as heart or spirit. And the reason for why it's called an enthymeme is because in your heart or in your spirit or in your rationality, you have to then fill in that missing part that the speaker didn't give you. So this is how we actually talk when we make arguments. We usually talk in enthymemes, and we usually have 2 of the parts of a syllogism, but not the 3rd one. What I want you to learn today, and what's going to be really tricky for a lot of you, and that's totally fine, is how to work backwards from an enthymeme to a syllogism. And the reason I want you to be able to do that is because the part that's often missing, that major premise, in our triangle of claim, evidence, and reasoning, is the reasoning. And that reasoning is usually flawed. That reasoning we might take for granted as something that's true all of the time when it's only true some of the time. That reasoning might be racist or sexist or xenophobic. That reasoning might just not apply. It just might be flawed. So I want you to be able to work backwards, because if you can point out people's reasoning, and that reasoning is usually the weakest part of the argument, that'll give you the advantage in trying to win that argument. And if you can do it with your own arguments, it'll help you figure out where your weaknesses are in your persuasion, and it'll make them stronger. So just to recap a little bit, a syllogism is what we have when we have all 3 of the parts. It's a major premise, a general rule that's known, a new scenario or a new example that's unknown, and then a conclusion that we can draw from the pairing of those information. The problem with syllogisms is they're usually predictable and formulaic. If I have all x's are y's, w is an x, most of you can then figure out w is also a y. We don't actually talk like that. But the other problem with syllogisms is we expect them to be absolute. We expect them to apply in all cases, but there's still usually a relative degree of uncertainty when we're talking about syllogisms. And we often pretend that that uncertainty isn't there because by and large human beings don't like uncertainty. When we're dealing with enthymemes instead, what we have is a capacity for surprise. And the reason for that is because one of the premises, and usually the major premise, is left out of the conversation. So we have to dig backwards and we have to do some mental gymnastics to find it. The other thing that enthymemes do for us as the speaker or as the persuader is that if there's a part of our argument that's pretty weak, enthymemes allow us to hide that weak part of the argument. We don't have to say it, and if we don't say it and the audience doesn't hear it, then they're probably not going to think too critically about it. Enthymemes also work well for uncertainty. If syllogisms can't get us past absolute situations, enthymemes give us relative situations where we're a little bit more comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty and a lack of clarity. If we can work backwards from an enthymeme to a syllogism, what we can do is usually identify the reasoning that's there, and that reasoning is usually a problem. So let's talk a little bit about enthymemes. I'll give you an example here. This was a thesis statement from a speech that one of my students gave a few years ago. The US Congress should tax fatty and sugary foods because it will fight obesity. That's the enthymeme that they gave us. They gave us a claim, and in that claim they also gave us a piece of evidence for that claim. The claim is what your audience wants you to accept as true, that you may or may not buy. It could be otherwise, to use stasis theory language that we talked about last week. The claim is what they're trying to change your mind about, so that part is usually persuasive. The evidence is usually not as persuasive, although sometimes it can be, but usually the evidence is something that most of us will accept at face value. So if we were trying to break this sentence down into two parts, what do you think is the claim here? The claim is usually at one of the 5 stases. There's a key word in here that should give away what the claim is. So anybody want to try and tell us? It's only part of the sentence up here. What is the claim that your audience wants you to accept? Yeah. Good. The US Congress should tax fatty and sugary foods. The way we'll put it when we talk about your small group deliberations is governing body should specific policy. That is a claim at one of the 5 stases. It happens to be at the last stasis, the stasis of policy. They're trying to argue someone should do something. The other part of this is that they could actually say otherwise. The United States should not, or the Congress should not tax fatty and sugary foods. What then, if that's our claim, what is the evidence being offered to help support that claim? It's the other part of the sentence. What's the evidence here? Let's see if I can get someone else, otherwise I'll come back to you. Yeah? Because taxing fatty and sugary foods will fight obesity. That's a piece of evidence that most of us are probably willing to accept more or less at face value. If we raise taxes on fatty and sugary foods, it will help fight obesity. So that's what the claim tells us. If we look at the enthymeme rewritten as a syllogism, it might look something like this. We start with the claim, if the US wants to fight obesity, it should tax fatty and sugary foods. The minor premise here is that reducing the consumption of fatty and sugary foods will help fight obesity. The missing premise that's not stated by my former student in this speech is that taxes on goods, raising taxes, will lower consumption. That is, if we make fatty and sugary foods more expensive, people will be less likely to buy them. And you can think about what you make of that claim. A lot of you probably are pretty willing to accept parts of the major premise, or maybe all of the major premise, as true. If you think about the major premise, though, there might be some flaws in that. So what you're going to do, actually, yeah, let's try that. So if we take our fatty and sugary fats, the claim tells you that taxing fatty and sugary foods will help fight obesity. If we are trying to figure out the reasoning, the major premise, taxes on goods limit consumption, what are some problems that might exist with that major premise? Can anybody think of reasons why that might not be true? The top one here, the major premise? Yeah. Okay, so a lot of people smoke cigarettes. People have been raising taxes on on cigarettes, and a lot of people still consume them. So if somebody really likes something, or if somebody is a little bit addicted to something, they will be willing to pay more for it. Not just cigarettes, but how many of you think about this every time you go fill up at the pump? And North Dakota or Minnesota has a gas tax, and if they raise that gas tax under the assumption that raising that tax will limit gas consumption, a lot of you still need to get to work. It doesn't really matter how much you raise taxes, because if you still need to drive your car, that's still a problem. Are there other flaws with anywhere in this enthymeme rewritten as a syllogism? Yeah. Fatty and sugary foods are not the only thing that causes obesity. So they might be contributing factors. We're critiquing the minor premise now. They might be contributing factors, but there are other things that help cause obesity, like a sedentary lifestyle, like genetics. There are other problems with that. Anybody else? Is that what you were going to say? Go ahead. Okay, so we might have a jurisdiction here. Maybe Congress doesn't have the power to decide this on a federal level. Maybe it has to be left up to individual states or individual counties. It might not be a federal issue. What I'm getting at here is that when we're testing syllogisms and enthymemes, the speaker is trying to say particular things, but what they're not saying is often more interesting than what they are saying. So you guys hinted at a couple of things that are problematic in that major premise or in that minor premise. There are other causes of obesity. People might be willing to pay more for those things. Another thing that you didn't say is that there are a lot of companies that make a lot of money from producing fatty and sugary foods. Nestle, Coca-Cola, right? There are lots of people who make a lot of money off of this, and they probably don't want to lose profits. So what's more interesting is usually what the speaker is not saying, and in order to get what they're not saying, you usually have to work backwards from the enthymeme to the syllogism. And if you can do that, the problems with the major premise that's omitted are usually pretty glaring. They're usually pretty clear. So if you're going to try this out, and we are going to try it out with a couple of examples, what you need to do are 4 different things. The first thing is that you need to identify what the conclusion is. That conclusion is going to be a claim, and the claim is going to be at one of the 5 stases. So it might be a policy claim. A lot of our examples have been. But it could easily be a value claim. It could easily be a definition claim. You want to identify what that conclusion is, and the hint there is that usually that thing could be otherwise. From there, there's another part that the speaker gives you. They give you one of the premises. They give you some pieces of evidence to support that claim. That's what you're going to identify as your support, and that support is usually, but not always, the minor premise in our syllogism. So if you write out major premise, minor premise, conclusion, if you start with the conclusion and work backwards up to the major premise, that's going to help you. From there, what you need to do is figure out what is the missing premise, and in order to get at that missing premise, what Stephen Toulmin in the 20th century called a warrant, what you need to do is figure out a way to make that syllogism both valid and sound. So it has to follow the proper format, and the major premise and the minor premise both have to be true. And it's usually the most direct link from evidence in your major premise reasoning in your major premise to evidence in the minor premise to the claim that is your conclusion. Once you've identified that missing premise, once you're able to figure out the thing that the speaker is not saying that would make that a valid syllogism, that's when you get into cross-examination mode. If you think about this like a courtroom and you're cross-examining the witness, this is where you can then come in and do all of the critical thinking that you all just did and say maybe raising taxes in order to fight obesity isn't the best way to do that. Now, if you're going to do that, we want to make sure that we are not making assumptions. Most of the time, the reasoning is where that assumption is. And if you remember from a few weeks ago, we try never to assume because what? Good. Never assume because it makes an ass out of you and me. That warrant, that missing premise, that thing that that speaker is not saying is usually flawed in some capacity. And you have to identify what it is in order to figure out what's wrong with it. So let's try that 4-step process. I'll work with you on it. We'll do it 1 step at a time. Like I said, some of you might get frustrated with this. Some of you might get some stuff wrong. We're going to work through a couple of these examples. I don't necessarily expect you during today's lesson or even right after today's lesson to get this right away. I want you to practice it because this is one of the best tools that you all can give yourself. So I put an enthymeme up on the board. We're going to work on putting this back as a syllogism. And once we do, we're going to be able to figure out how to critique it. So the enthymeme that we have is Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow. Punxsutawney Phil is the groundhog that's used in Groundhog's Day. Punxsutawney is a town in Pennsylvania. I used to live about 45 minutes from there. If you're familiar with Groundhog's Day, you know what this looks like. So Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow. It looks like there will be 6 more weeks of winter this year. There's a claim there, and there's a piece of evidence there. Let's start with the claim. Let's start with our conclusion. What's our conclusion? Yeah. The conclusion is there will be 6 more weeks of winter. That is something that could be otherwise. Usually when we're talking about Groundhog's Day, it's either 2 more weeks of winter or 6 more weeks of winter. So the conclusion is there will be 6 more weeks of winter, but it could be otherwise. It could be that there will only be 2 more weeks of winter, or there might be 7 more weeks of winter, or 2.5 more weeks of winter. That's the conclusion. That conclusion is at one of our 5 stases. Does anybody want to try and tell us which stasis it's at? This is bonus points if you get it. It's trying to predict whether something will be the case or will not be the case. Go ahead. It could be that. I could see how you'd make an argument for that. But if we're just dealing with predictions of the future, it's usually more that we're dealing with the stasis of factor conjecture. Is it going to be the case? Is it not going to be the case? What's causing it is actually probably the reasoning in this case, so you're not far off. Good. So we have our claim. We have our conclusion. Let's work backwards to find the evidence for that claim. What evidence is being provided here? How do you know that there will be 6 more weeks of winter? Somebody else. Go ahead. The groundhog saw his shadow. So that's our minor premise. That's our evidence that's being offered. If we were to work backwards, what is our major premise? What is the missing piece that's being omitted here? Okay, one way of putting it is groundhogs determine the weather. Another way of putting it is if we have a hypothetical syllogism, we've got an if-then there. If Punxsutawney Phil sees his shadow, then there will be 6 more weeks of winter. But if we were to try and examine that a little bit more, how do we know that that if-then statement is true? If Punxsutawney Phil sees his shadow, then there will be 6 more weeks of winter. How do we know that? Is it scientific fact? Is it some other reason that we know? Yeah. Yeah, it's just legend and folklore. So that's not really all that strong to work off of. The legend in Pennsylvania says that when this animal sees his shadow, that determines how much more winter there will be, except when it doesn't. The problem is that Punxsutawney Phil is a rodent. He's not a meteorologist. So we got a problem here with the logic. In order to get there, we had to work backwards a little bit. Let's try another one here. I'm going to ruin one of your favorite Disney movies. Cinderella must be the girl who left the glass slipper at the ball. When she tried it on, it fit perfectly. There's a claim there. There's a piece of evidence there. Let's see if we can start with the claim. Somebody new, try to tell us, what is the claim that could be otherwise here? What's the speaker trying to get you to accept as true? Yeah. Okay. Cinderella must be the girl who left the glass slipper at the ball. That is our conclusion. It could be Cinderella. It could be somebody else. We want you to believe that it's definitely Cinderella. How do we know that Cinderella left the glass slipper at the ball? The glass slipper fit on her foot. So if we have the first sentence here as our conclusion, the second one is our minor premise, what is the major premise that we would need to accept as true in order to get to that conclusion from that evidence?
Cinderella's the only one that has the exact same shoe size.
Good. So the other way of putting it is all women have feet of different sizes. That is the major premise that we're missing here. It would assume that every woman has a different shoe size, and the shoe can only fit one woman, and that woman has to be the one who left it. We know, however, if you are a woman or if you have sisters or significant others, a lot of women have the same shoe size, and I know this because both my sisters happen to be the same shoe size, and they steal each other's shoes all the time. So it's possible that Cinderella was the girl who left the glass slipper at the ball, but we don't know that for certain. The only way that we know that for certain is because we all have the bird's eye view, third-person omniscient view of the story, and we watch the whole story unfold. We watched Cinderella go to the ball. We watched her dance with the prince. We watched her run away because she thought she was going to turn into a pumpkin. We saw her leave the glass slipper at the ball. But we don't know that with certainty based on the evidence that we're given. So sorry for ruining one of your favorite Disney movies. Let's try another one here. This one's an internet meme. This one always makes me laugh. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. I trust that you can do that. Let's see if we can figure out, again, the conclusion, the evidence, the reasoning, and then the flaws in the reasoning. That's our 4-step process. Anybody want to try and give us our conclusion or our claim? Yeah, go ahead. Good. Another way of putting that conclusion is those 2 words in red are equally valid ways of spelling and pronouncing the word fish. What then is the evidence being offered for that claim? What's our minor premise here, that evidence? Let's see if I can get someone else. How do we know that those are both equally valid ways of spelling the word fish? What's the evidence being offered here? Yeah. Okay. Good. So we have examples of other words in the English language where GH, O, and TI are pronounced F, I, Sh. That's our evidence. So if we were to try and accept this conclusion from that evidence, what is the major premise that would make this a valid syllogism? Yeah. Welcome to the English language. And what do they mean by that? Do you want to try? Good. The major premise that we would have to accept here is that the English language is internally consistent. That every time we spell words, we spell them and pronounce them the same way. If you know your history, you know that the English language is a bastardization of Anglo-Saxon and French and some Germanic languages and everything else that's been thrown in since. English is horribly inconsistent with spelling, horribly inconsistent with meanings. I applied for a job at the Writing Center at my undergrad institution. When I applied for my job, the interviewers asked me, "Hey Brad, you're going to be working a lot with international students. How are you going to handle that?" And my response to them that made them all laugh was, well, I've spent the last 2 years studying biblical Hebrew. The only thing that I could think of that would be worse than studying biblical Hebrew would be learning English. English is just horribly inconsistent, so that major premise is flawed. Therefore, we know that we can't accept that conclusion that GHOTI should be pronounced fish. We'll try another practice one. Another one, this was a common way of thinking and practicing medicine in the Middle Ages. Leeches will cure what ails you. They'll get rid of all that bad blood. And when I'm talking about bad blood, I'm not talking about that horrible Taylor Swift song. I do not Taylor Swift. I'm sorry for those of you who do. But let's see if we can figure out what is our conclusion. Anybody want to try and offer the conclusion here? There's a conclusion, there's an evidence piece. Yeah. Okay, leeches will cure what ails you is actually our conclusion here. Leeches will make you feel better if you're getting sick. The evidence being provided for that is kind of like what we had before. It's a causal relationship, so we're actually dealing with two different claims here. And the second claim is being used as support for that first claim. Leeches will cure what ails you. That second claim is what's the evidence here. That is our minor premise. They'll get rid of all of that bad blood. Okay, so if that's the case, what is the major premise that we would have to accept in order to draw that conclusion from that piece of evidence? Let's see if I can get someone new. Anybody new? All right, I'll let you try again. Yeah, that all of our diseases are in the blood, and really that good blood and bad blood exist, and that leeches know the difference between good blood and bad blood. That's all kind of broadly speaking our major premise. Good blood and bad blood exist, and leeches are the animals that know the difference. If leeches know the difference between good blood and bad blood, then leeches will cure what ails you. What's a problem with that logic? What are some problems with that logic? There is good and bad blood, and leeches know the difference. What's some problems there that you see? You all are pretty smart. Let's see. Okay, so good blood and bad blood were just a theory, and they were a pretty bad medical theory at that. Good blood and bad blood don't exist. If good blood and bad blood did exist, yeah, a parasite as dumb as leeches probably wouldn't know the difference between good blood and bad blood. And if we cover our body in leeches, what's another problem there? Yeah. Yep. You'll let out too much blood. A lot of our blood helps fight our diseases. If we're draining that blood from our body or if we just bleed too much, we die. So a lot of people died from this kind of treatment. There's lots of problems with that logic. You can probably see them a little bit when you start looking at the picture as a whole or when you get that enthymeme in the first place, but it'll do you much better to work backwards from enthymeme to syllogism. So your last one to try today is your participation question, and that is the enthymeme that's on the screen now. You can go ahead and log into Blackboard. The enthymeme that I'm giving you is my tax dollars should not go to funding higher education because my kid's already graduated. What you're going to do is start and figure out what's the conclusion there. From that conclusion, what evidence is being offered in that enthymeme? What is the major premise reasoning that's not being stated in that enthymeme? And then maybe if we have time, what are some of the flaws with that major premise. So you can go ahead and log into Blackboard. We are in week 10. As always, if you have any trouble with logging into Blackboard or submitting your answer, you can go ahead and email that to your lab instructor. But take some time, write down major premise, minor premise, conclusion, work through the enthymeme backwards until it is a valid syllogism. That'll give you your answer, and if we have time, we are out of time. Sorry about that. Then we would have spent time unpacking that. Does anybody think they know what the correct answer is here? Yeah. You think it's B. Why do you think it's B? Okay. If we were to work backwards, let's look at this. I'll give it to you because we're a little bit out of time. My tax dollars should not go to funding higher education. That we could probably identify as our claim because we have the keyword should, and should could always be should not. Our evidence then is my kid's already graduated. The major premise that would make this a valid syllogism then is higher education funding should only come from current students' tuition dollars. That's the claim that you have to buy in order to buy that conclusion. If you think about it, you could probably think of some flaws with that, like if everyone who didn't have kids in college didn't give money to higher ed, then your tuition dollars would go way up. So be careful with that. I see some questions, but the rest of you, once you're good, are free to go. Send it to your lab instructor. Yep, just a letter.